When you think of Egypt, it's impossible not to think of the Nile River, a ribbon of life cutting through endless desert. For over 7,000 years, this river has been the defining feature of Egypt's geography, economy, religion, and identity. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus put it best: Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Today, we'll explore just how deep that truth runs. To understand why the Nile mattered so much, we first need to understand what makes a civilization. A civilization is defined as a society that shares common culture, common laws, a common economy, and often a common faith or religion. It is more complex than a tribe or a village. It's organized, stratified, and enduring. And if you look across the map of the ancient world, you'll notice a pattern. Civilizations sprouted along rivers: the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Indus in South Asia, the Yellow River in China. And in Africa, the Nile provided the foundation for what would become one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. The Nile is the longest river in the world, stretching over 4,000 miles from its sources in East Africa to the Mediterranean Sea. It has two major tributaries: the White Nile, flowing from modern Uganda and South Sudan, and the Blue Nile, rushing down from the Ethiopian highlands. These rivers converge near modern-day Khartoum in Sudan, and then the Nile flows northward through the Sahara Desert, straight into Egypt. Unlike most rivers, which flow southward, the Nile flows north. The current carries water from Central Africa all the way to the sea, while the winds blow from the Mediterranean southward. This combination meant that boats could travel in both directions. It was, in effect, a natural highway that linked Upper Egypt in the south with Lower Egypt in the north. The Egyptians themselves had names for the regions the Nile created. They called the fertile valley Kemet, which translates as the Black Land. This name came from the deep, dark soil left behind when the Nile flooded its banks each year. In contrast, the surrounding desert was called Deshret, meaning the Red Land. The desert was barren, dangerous, and lifeless. This stark contrast, Black Land of fertility against Red Land of death, defined how Egyptians thought about their world. Without the Nile's floods, all of Egypt would have been Deshret, and civilization there would have been impossible. Every June, the Nile began to rise. Snowmelt and rains from the Ethiopian highlands swelled the river, and by September, it flooded across the valley. By October, the waters receded, leaving behind a layer of nutrient-rich silt, perfect for growing crops. Unlike floods in other parts of the world, which were often violent and unpredictable, the Nile's inundation was remarkably consistent. The Egyptians came to depend on it, even to worship it. They personified the flood as a god named Hapi, who brought abundance each year. When floods were too low, famine threatened. When they were too high, villages could be destroyed. But most years, the cycle was dependable enough that Egyptians could plan their lives around it. This regularity gave rise to what historians call the Nilotic calendar, one of the first agricultural calendars in history, dividing the year into 3 seasons: flooding, planting, and harvesting. By around 1500 BC, Egyptians were no longer just hunter-gatherers. They were farmers. They grew wheat, barley, lentils, onions, flax for linen, and papyrus reeds for writing. But they didn't just wait for the river to flood. They engineered it. The earliest Egyptians dug canals and built basins to trap floodwaters. They created irrigation ditches to channel water into fields long after the flood had receded. This system allowed for surplus crops, which in turn supported a larger population, freed people from farming full-time, and laid the groundwork for specialized trades, social hierarchies, and eventually centralized government. Let's pause for a glossary moment. Papyrus. Papyrus was a plant that grew thickly along the Nile's banks. Egyptians discovered they could cut its stalks, press them, and dry them into sheets for writing. This invention gave us one of the earliest forms of paper. On papyrus, Egyptians wrote in hieroglyphs, their formal writing system. Hieroglyphs combined pictures and symbols to represent words, sounds, and concepts. Thanks to the Nile's papyrus, Egyptian ideas were preserved for millennia, from sacred texts to everyday receipts. Without papyrus, we might know far less about their history today. The Nile was more than farmland. It was a thoroughfare. Boats traveled up and down the river, carrying grain, stone, gold, copper, and even exotic animals. Temples and pyramids required massive limestone and granite blocks, some weighing over 30 tons. How were they moved? The answer is the river. In 2024, archaeologists confirmed a now-vanished branch of the Nile, called the Ahramat Branch, ran close to the Giza plateau during pyramid construction. Workers used this channel to transport stone blocks directly to the construction sites. Without the Nile's transport network, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, built around 2560 BC, covering 13 acres and originally 481 feet tall, would have been impossible to construct. The Nile wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Egyptians saw the river as divine. They worshipped Hapi, the god of the flood. They believed Osiris, god of the afterlife, had taught them agriculture, linking the river's fertility to eternal life. Crocodiles along the river were tied to Sobek, a fierce but protective deity. The connection was so strong that many religious festivals aligned with the flood season. To Egyptians, the river's rise and fall mirrored the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. It was, in every sense, sacred. Geography shapes politics. The Nile Valley is long and narrow, stretching about 600 miles within Egypt. This geography made it easier to unify than, say, Mesopotamia, which sprawled across wide plains. The river acted as a binding force, linking Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. By around 3100 BC, King Narmer of Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt and created the first unified Egyptian state. He built his capital at Memphis, strategically located where Upper and Lower Egypt met. The unification of Egypt was only possible because the Nile made communication, transport, and food distribution feasible across the whole region. Modern science continues to reveal the Nile's role. Satellite imagery shows ancient canals and harbors long buried under desert sands. Archaeologists have found entire towns near pyramid sites, suggesting that pharaohs organized massive labor forces, housed them, fed them bread and beer, all thanks to food surpluses the Nile made possible. Even climate studies suggest the Old Kingdom collapsed around 2200 BC, partly due to a series of low Nile floods, which caused famine, unrest, and civil war. In other words, the river didn't just create Egypt, it could also bring it to its knees. Let's quickly review some glossary terms. Civilization, a complex society with shared culture, laws, economy, and often religion. Nile River, the longest river in the world, lifeblood of Egypt. Kemet, the black land, fertile soil left by the Nile's floods. Deshret, the red land, barren desert surrounding the Nile Valley. Irrigation, systems of canals and basins designed to spread Nile waters to fields. Papyrus, a reed plant used to make one of the first forms of paper. Hieroglyphs, Egyptian writing system using pictures and symbols. Ahramat Branch, a now-vanished Nile channel used during pyramid construction. So when we say Egypt was the gift of the Nile, it isn't just a poetic phrase. It's literal. Without the Nile's water, soil, and transport, there would have been no crops, no unity, no pyramids, no pharaohs, no Egypt at all. This single river carved out one of the greatest civilizations in history, and it continues to shape Egypt to this day. In our next episode, we'll look more closely at what the Egyptians called their land, Kemet, and how a name reveals a whole worldview.